What if everything you have ever been taught about your life, your duty, and your safety was a carefully constructed lie, designed not to protect you, but to keep you obedient until the moment you are no longer useful? You are alive in the Imperium of Man, and that alone means you have already lost. Not because you are weak, not because you failed, but because the era you were born into does not value survival, happiness, or truth. It values only endurance until you break, and usefulness until you are discarded. This is the most horrifying time to be alive in Warhammer 40,000, not because the galaxy is full of monsters, but because the greatest monster is the system that tells you everything is fine while it quietly feeds you into the grinder. To understand why this time is worse than any other, you must first understand the lie. The Imperium teaches that humanity stands united beneath the light of the God Emperor. It tells you that your suffering has meaning, that your labor is sacred, and that your obedience keeps the darkness at bay. From the moment you can understand words, you are taught prayers instead of questions, obedience instead of curiosity, faith instead of knowledge. History is not explained, it is simplified, stripped of context, and hammered into slogans. Ignorance is not a failure here. It is policy. Most humans will never know the true state of the galaxy. They will never learn how close the Imperium is to collapse, how thin the walls really are, or how many worlds vanish every single day without ceremony or record. They will live and die believing they are part of something eternal, something strong, something victorious. That belief is the only thing standing between order and mass panic, and the Imperium guards it more fiercely than any weapon. On paper, humanity rules a million worlds. In reality, most of those worlds are barely surviving. Hive cities stretch into polluted skies, stacked layer upon layer with human lives treated as raw material. Entire generations are born, work, and die without ever seeing natural sunlight. Food is recycled, air is filtered, water is rationed. Life expectancy is low, and expectations are lower. If you survive long enough to become old, it is considered a blessing. And yet, the average citizen is told they are lucky. Lucky not to be drafted into endless war. Lucky not to be accused of heresy. Lucky not to attract attention. Because attention is dangerous. To be noticed by the Imperium is rarely a good thing. It means you are either valuable, or expendable. Often both. The Imperium survives by categorizing suffering. There is acceptable suffering and unacceptable suffering. Acceptable suffering is starvation that does not spark rebellion, labor that does not end productivity, and death that does not disrupt output. Unacceptable suffering is chaos, panic, rebellion, doubt. The goal is not to eliminate pain. It is to manage it. This is why the truth is hidden. Because the truth would destroy what little stability remains. The truth is that the Imperium is not winning. It is not advancing. It is decaying, slowly and violently, under its own weight. Technology is no longer understood, only worshipped. Machines are prayed to instead of repaired. Knowledge is treated as heresy unless approved by ancient dogma. Innovation is feared, because change risks collapse, and collapse is already dangerously close. Every institution is ancient, bloated, and terrified of failure. The administratum drowns in paperwork decades out of date. Orders are sent to worlds that no longer exist. Relief fleets arrive centuries too late. Entire planetary populations are declared traitors because a message was mistranslated or delayed. And no one corrects these mistakes, because no one wants to admit them. The lie must remain intact. So the Imperium tells its people that sacrifice is noble. That dying in service is the highest honor. That there is no greater purpose than to give everything, body, mind, and soul, to a cause you will never fully understand. And most people accept this, because the alternative is unbearable. To accept the truth would mean acknowledging that your suffering is not part of a grand plan. It is simply fuel. What makes this era uniquely horrifying is not that people suffer. Humanity has always suffered in this universe. What makes it horrifying is that the Imperium now knows it is failing, and has decided that the only way to survive is to tighten its grip, not loosen it. There was a time when hope existed, even if it was fragile. A time when the Imperium still believed in reclamation, in rebuilding, in pushing back the darkness. That time is gone. In this era, survival is reactive, desperate, and brutal. Every decision is made under the assumption that tomorrow will be worse than today. And so the lie becomes more aggressive. Faith replaces reason entirely. The Emperor is no longer a distant symbol, he is a god whose silence is interpreted as divine will. Questioning is no longer ignorance, it is treason. Curiosity becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes accusation. Accusation becomes execution. This is not because the Imperium enjoys cruelty, but because it cannot afford uncertainty. You are told that enemies are everywhere. And they are. But what you are not told is how often the Imperium itself becomes the executioner long before any enemy arrives. Entire populations are erased preemptively. Worlds are sterilized to prevent potential corruption. Billions die not because they are guilty, but because they might become a risk. From the inside, it is impossible to tell when the Imperium is protecting you, and when it has decided you are already lost. Most citizens never see a Xenos. Never hear the screams of a demon. Never witness a space marine. Their horror is quieter, slower, and far more intimate. It is the fear of making a mistake that cannot be undone. Saying the wrong prayer, missing a quota, being reported by a neighbor who is just as afraid as you are. Because the Imperium does not need monsters in every street. It only needs fear to do the work for it. And this is only the beginning. Because beneath this fragile illusion of order, something far worse is happening. Something that cannot be hidden forever. Something that turns this era from merely brutal into truly nightmarish. The lie is cracking, the systems are straining, and the galaxy itself is beginning to bleed through the seams. The most horrifying time to be alive is not when the war begins. It is when you are still being told that everything is under control, while reality prepares to prove that it never was. What happens when the lie collapses, and the universe no longer pretends you are safe? There is a moment, sometimes sudden and sometimes slow, when an entire civilization realizes it has been holding its breath for far too long. In the Imperium of Man, that moment does not arrive with a single explosion or declaration of war. It arrives in fragments, missed messages, unanswered prayers, fleets that never arrive, and stars that go silent without explanation. This is the era when those fragments begin to form a picture, and the picture is unbearable. This is not just another bad century. This is the time when everything starts to fail at once. For thousands of years, the Imperium relied on distance and delay to mask its weakness. When a world fell, the news might take decades to arrive. When a sector went silent, it could be blamed on bureaucratic error or warp interference. Absence was easy to explain away when space itself was unreliable. But in this era, silence becomes too common, too widespread. Entire regions of the galaxy stop responding, not for years, but forever. Astropaths begin to die in their chambers, screaming of things they cannot describe. Navigators report stars shifting position, routes becoming unusable overnight, familiar passages through the warp turning hostile or simply vanishing. Fleets emerge light years off course, or not at all. Time fractures. Messages arrive before they are sent. Warnings are received after the disaster they were meant to prevent has already happened. The Imperium has no language for this kind of failure. Because this is not an enemy behaving unpredictably. This is reality itself becoming unreliable. The era becomes known, quietly, unofficially, in whispers among those who still have access to forbidden records, as a time of dying screams. Not because the galaxy is louder, but because fewer people are listening. Entire worlds cry out for help and are answered by nothing. Others are never heard from again, erased so completely that even their names rot away in the archives. This is when the idea of rescue dies. Imperial doctrine has always promised that loyalty would be rewarded, that if a world endured long enough, aid would come. A fleet, a crusade, reinforcements blessed by the Emperor himself. In this era, those promises become meaningless. The Imperium is forced to make choices it can no longer hide, which worlds are worth saving, and which are not. And most are not. This is the true horror of the time, not the violence, but the triage. Entire planetary populations are reduced to numbers on a slate, their worth measured in resources, strategic position, or ideological purity. A world might burn not because it has fallen, but because saving it would cost too much. The people living there will never know this. They will die believing they were abandoned by fate, not deliberately sacrificed. The galaxy fills with these quiet extinctions. No last stands, no heroic final messages, just the slow disappearance of light as infrastructure fails, defenses crumble, and hope erodes into despair. Civil wars erupt as faith fractures. Some cling harder to religion, turning every misfortune into proof of divine testing. Others lose faith entirely, and that loss alone is enough to condemn them. Because doubt is contagious, the Imperium responds the only way it knows how, by becoming harsher. Travel restrictions tighten, information is sealed, entire data vaults are locked or purged. Knowledge becomes more dangerous than ever, because knowledge reveals patterns, and patterns reveal the truth. That the Imperium is not collapsing in one place, but everywhere. And then comes the moment when even the most loyal servants can no longer deny it. The sky changes. On countless worlds, stars flicker or vanish entirely. Night lasts too long. Day arrives too late. Astronomical charts no longer match what people see above them. For most citizens, this is the first undeniable sign that something is wrong. You can ignore a missed shipment. You can accept a ration cut. But you cannot ignore the heavens themselves turning unfamiliar. Fear spreads, not as panic, but as exhaustion. The kind of fear that sinks into bones and never leaves. The realization that whatever is happening is far bigger than any army, any fleet, any god humanity worships. This is not a war that can be won with enough sacrifice. This is a shift in the universe's rules. And deep within the Imperium's highest chambers, a truth is spoken only once, then buried beneath layers of classification and prayer. This era is not temporary. There will be no return to normal. No restoration of stability. The systems that once held humanity together are unraveling faster than they can be repaired. Every solution creates two new crises. Every victory reveals another front collapsing elsewhere. From this point on, the Imperium is no longer fighting to win. It is fighting to delay extinction. And as the lie continues to crumble, something far worse begins to happen, something that no amount of censorship can fully contain. The boundary between nightmare and reality thins. The horrors humanity once feared from a distance begin to seep into everyday life. Not as invasions, but as symptoms. The galaxy is no longer just hostile. It is breaking, and in the next chapter of this story, you will understand what it truly means when reality itself starts to fail, when the universe stops pretending it cares whether you survive at all. What do you do when the universe itself stops obeying the rules you were taught to trust? At first, no one calls it what it is. The Imperium never does. There are no official proclamations announcing that reality has begun to fracture. Instead, there are new words added quietly to old reports: anomalous, unverified, spiritually compromised. These are the Imperium's way of saying that something is wrong without admitting that it is afraid. Because fear, once acknowledged, spreads faster than any plague. The warp was always dangerous. Humanity knew this. It was the nightmare ocean through which its ships sailed, barely held at bay by ancient technology and half-forgotten rituals. But it was distant, contained, a necessary evil that existed between stars, not within them. In this era, that separation begins to dissolve. It starts subtly. People report dreams that feel heavier than sleep, as if something is pressing down on their thoughts. Not visions, not prophecies, just a sense of being watched, evaluated, weighed. On some worlds, animals refuse to enter certain structures. Children speak words they were never taught. Machines malfunction in patterns that feel intentional, as if they are hesitating. The Imperium dismisses these reports as stress, mass hysteria, or religious fervor. Officially, nothing has changed. Unofficially, entire departments of sanctioned psychers and inquisitorial observers are overwhelmed. They burn records as fast as they create them, not because the data is useless, but because it is too revealing. Because the same symptoms are appearing everywhere. Time becomes unreliable. On one world, a shift worker finishes a rotation only to discover that days have passed instead of hours. On another, an entire settlement experiences the same morning repeatedly, each iteration slightly worse than the last. Supply ships arrive before they were sent. Reinforcements emerge from the warp-bearing distress calls dated decades in the future. These are not isolated incidents. They are fractures. The boundary between thought and manifestation weakens. Strong emotions begin to leave marks. Fear lingers in rooms long after the source is gone. Anger feels heavier, more physical. Faith becomes volatile, either a shield or a weapon, depending on how tightly it is held. And those with even the slightest psychic sensitivity suffer the most. Many of them do not survive. They hear whispers they cannot silence. Feel presences they cannot escape. Some beg for execution before they lose themselves. Others are not granted that mercy. They are taken away, classified, processed, and used, because even in the middle of reality's collapse, the Imperium needs tools. What makes this era uniquely terrifying is not that demons appear in every street. It is that people cannot tell where their own thoughts end and something else begins. The fear is internal, intimate, a slow erosion of identity. You wake up unsure whether the dread you feel belongs to you, or was placed there. And once that doubt exists, it never fully leaves. Entire populations begin to behave differently. Productivity drops. Violence increases without clear cause. Faith splinters into extremes, obsessive devotion on one end, silent nihilism on the other. Both are dangerous. One invites scrutiny, the other invites execution. The middle ground, quiet survival, shrinks until it barely exists. The Imperium responds with control. More patrols, more sermons, more public punishments meant to remind people that order still exists. But these measures no longer feel reassuring. They feel desperate, like someone shouting commands into a storm, hoping volume can replace authority. And beneath it all, the warp presses closer. On some worlds, the sky takes on impossible colors. Not dramatic enough to spark immediate panic, just wrong enough to unsettle. Shadows linger where there should be none. Sounds echo too long. People swear they see figures at the edges of their vision, never directly, always just enough to make them question themselves. Questioning is the most dangerous act of all. Because the moment you accept that reality is changing, you also accept that the Imperium might not be able to protect you from it. And that thought is enough to shatter loyalty. Enough to invite corruption. Enough to justify annihilation. This is when the purges begin to escalate. Not because corruption has been proven, but because it is suspected. Entire communities are erased based on probability, not evidence. Better to kill 10 million innocents than allow one breach. Better to burn a world than risk it becoming something worse. The cruelty is not born of malice. It is born of fear. Those in power understand something the average citizen does not, that the warp is no longer just a place ships travel through. It is becoming a presence, a pressure, a constant weight against the fabric of existence. And the more the Imperium tightens its grip, the more strained that fabric becomes. Reality does not snap all at once. It tears slowly, painfully, in ways that cannot be stitched back together. And as the cracks widen, the people trapped within them begin to realize a terrible truth. There is no line anymore between war and peace, sanity and madness, life and something far worse. The universe is no longer a stable stage on which horrors occasionally appear. The universe itself has become the horror. And in the next section of this story, you will see what happens when the Imperium finally turns inward, when survival itself becomes a crime, and the greatest threat to humanity is no longer what comes from beyond, but what is willing to do to its own people to endure just a little longer. What happens when the people sworn to protect humanity decide that humanity itself is the problem? There is a point in every collapsing empire when the enemy is no longer at the gates, but inside the walls. In the Imperium of Man, that point arrives quietly, wrapped in official language and sealed orders. No announcement is made, no confession is offered. The change is felt not as a single act of betrayal, but as a gradual realization that obedience no longer guarantees survival. This is the moment when the Imperium turns on its own. At first, it looks like discipline. Increased inspections, loyalty audits, mandatory confessions conducted by officials who already assume guilt. Entire professions are reevaluated, not for competence, but for ideological purity. The question is no longer, can you do your job? But, are you dangerous if you fail? Fear becomes a resource to be managed. The Inquisition expands its reach, not because it has uncovered more heresy, but because uncertainty itself is now considered heretical. Worlds that show signs of instability, lower production, religious deviation, unexplained phenomena, are flagged for intervention. Intervention rarely means assistance. It means containment. Containment is polite language for extermination. Populations are relocated into camps under the pretense of protection. In reality, they are being observed, tested, and quietly culled. Those who show resistance disappear first. Those who comply last slightly longer. No one is told why. No one is told where the others went. Silence becomes the most common answer to every question. The cruelty of this era is not chaotic. It is methodical. Commissars are instructed to execute without hesitation, not as punishment, but as example. Entire regiments are destroyed by their own officers when morale dips too low. Soldiers who have fought for decades are labeled liabilities because exhaustion looks too much like doubt. Loyalty oaths are renewed constantly, not to reinforce faith, but to identify cracks. And the cracks are everywhere. Because people are tired. They have seen too many fleets fail to arrive. Too many prayers go unanswered. Too many worlds erased from maps as if they never existed. Even the most devout begin to feel the strain, and the Imperium cannot allow that feeling to spread. So it sharpens its blade inward. The most horrifying aspect of this time is how reasonable the decisions seem from the top. Every purge can be justified. Every massacre can be explained as necessary. Every destroyed world can be described as a regrettable but unavoidable loss. The language of survival is powerful, and it erases guilt with frightening efficiency. No one believes they are the villain. An inquisitor who orders a planet sterilized does not see billions of lives. They see probabilities, risk curves, scenarios in which allowing that planet to survive leads to something worse. Something unspeakable, and they may be right, or they may be wrong. In this era, the difference no longer matters. The Imperium cannot afford to find out. For the people on the ground, the experience is suffocating. You are not fighting an enemy you can see. You are navigating a system where one wrong word, one missed ritual, one misunderstood expression can end your existence. Neighbors become informants out of fear, not malice. Families fracture under the weight of suspicion. Trust becomes extinct. Some worlds attempt to resist. Not openly, not rebellions, not revolutions, but subtle defiance. Skipped quotas, hidden refugees, delayed reports. These acts are rarely discovered immediately. When they are, the response is overwhelming. The Imperium does not negotiate with hesitation. It eradicates it. This is when exterminatus becomes common. Not legendary, not rare, just another line item, another solution to an unsolvable problem. Entire planets burn to ash because the cost of saving them exceeds the cost of losing them. The decision is made light years away by someone who will never see the surface, never hear the screams, never smell the aftermath. And yet, they sleep at night. Because the Imperium has convinced itself that it has no choice. The greatest irony of this era is that the Imperium's brutality accelerates the very collapse it fears. Each purge creates more instability. Each act of terror pushes more people toward despair. And despair, in this universe, is never empty. It attracts attention, but by the time this becomes obvious, it is too late. The Imperium has crossed a line it cannot retreat from. Survival has become indistinguishable from self-destruction. To live under its rule now is to exist in a state of constant probation, where your life is tolerated only as long as it remains useful. This is the most horrifying realization of all, that in this era, being human is not a right. It is a temporary condition, granted and revoked at the discretion of a system that is terrified of its own shadow. And as fear tightens its grip and mercy disappears entirely, another truth emerges, one that strips away the last illusion of escape. Because even if you survive the Imperium's suspicion, even if you avoid the purges and the fires, there is still nowhere left to run. In the next part of this story, you will understand why there is no safe place, no safe choice, and no safe death left in the galaxy, only different ways to suffer before the end finally comes. Where do you go when every possible escape leads to another kind of nightmare? By the time most people understand how bad things have become, the question of escape has already lost its meaning. The Imperium has always told its citizens that there are choices: serve faithfully, enlist, relocate, endure. In this era, those choices still exist, but each one is a different corridor leading deeper into the same darkness. There is no safe path anymore. Only delays. Some try to flee their worlds. They sell everything, bribe officials, and beg for passage aboard overcrowded transports. The ships that take them are ancient, unreliable, and already carrying far more souls than they were ever meant to hold. Even before entering the warp, people begin to die, of disease, dehydration, or violence born from desperation. Those who survive the journey face something worse. The warp no longer respects boundaries. Ships vanish without explanation, others arrive twisted, their crews changed in ways no report dares describe fully. Refugees who believed they were escaping a dying world emerge into a system already under quarantine, only to be executed on arrival. Fleeing is not freedom, it is a gamble with impossible odds. Others believe the military offers protection. To serve the Imperium's armies is to gain purpose, structure, and at least the promise of food and shelter. But this era has no room for heroes. Soldiers are deployed faster than they can be trained, thrown into wars they do not understand, against enemies that defy reason. Survival rates plummet. Entire regiments are wiped out and replaced without ceremony. Even those who survive combat are rarely allowed to leave it. Veterans carry scars not just on their bodies, but in their minds. They have seen worlds burn, comrades executed by their own officers, civilians slaughtered in the name of stability. The Imperium does not reward this knowledge. It fears it. Many veterans disappear into penal units or are quietly removed to prevent the spread of dangerous truths. Faith, once the Imperium's greatest shield, becomes another trap. Those who cling to religion seek comfort in certainty. They attend more services, recite longer prayers, and purge doubt from their thoughts. For some, faith provides structure in a universe that no longer makes sense. For others, it becomes obsession. Fanaticism rises, and with it, violence justified as divine will. And faith cuts both ways. Too much devotion attracts attention. Too little invites suspicion. To be seen as spiritually unstable is to be marked. Entire congregations vanish overnight, condemned not for heresy, but for the potential of it. In this era, belief is not about salvation. It is about survival, and even then, it often fails. Hiding is another illusion. Some attempt to disappear into the lowest layers of hive cities, into forgotten settlements, into data voids where records are incomplete. They believe anonymity will protect them. But the Imperium's reach is vast, and its fear is relentless. When resources grow scarce, the hidden are the first to be sacrificed. Unregistered populations are easy to erase. No records means no consequences. Even death offers no certainty. In a universe where the warp presses against reality, the boundary between life and what follows is no longer secure. Stories spread, quietly, fearfully, of souls that do not rest. Of consciousness lingering, trapped, consumed, or reshaped by forces beyond comprehension. Whether these stories are true matters less than the fact that people believe them. Because belief changes behavior, people stop seeking honorable deaths. They stop charging into battle for glory. They cling to existence, no matter how miserable, because oblivion is no longer guaranteed. The fear of what comes after becomes stronger than the fear of what comes before. This is what makes this era uniquely cruel. It removes every comforting lie at once. There is no sanctuary, no honorable sacrifice, no guaranteed release. Every option leads to suffering of a different flavor, and the choice itself becomes a burden. To decide is to take responsibility for pain, and most people are not given enough information to choose wisely. The Imperium does not correct this. It cannot, because to admit there is no safe choice would be to admit that the system itself has failed. And so it continues to offer paths it knows are broken, hoping people will walk them anyway. By this point, something fundamental has changed in the human psyche. Hope no longer feels like a virtue. It feels like a vulnerability. People stop asking how to survive and start asking how long they can endure. And then, slowly, another realization begins to surface, one far more terrifying than any monster or battlefield. The understanding that this is not a temporary crisis, not a dark chapter before recovery. This is the new normal. In the next section, everything converges. The wars, the fear, the faith, the fractures in reality, all of it crashes together in a single, unbearable truth. This is the moment when humanity finally understands why this time, above all others, is the most horrifying era to be alive. Because this is the moment when even denial can no longer protect you. What if the most terrifying truth isn't that humanity is losing, but that it has already lost, and is only now beginning to realize it? There comes a moment when denial finally exhausts itself. Not in panic, not in screams, but in silence. Across the galaxy, this moment arrives differently on every world, yet it feels the same everywhere. A stillness settles in, heavy and suffocating, as if the universe itself is waiting for humanity to acknowledge what it has been refusing to say out loud. This is the moment of absolute horror. Not when the first worlds burned. Not when reality began to fracture. Not even when the Imperium turned its guns inward. It is when humanity understands that none of this is leading toward recovery. The wars do not feel like wars anymore. They feel like symptoms. Endless, grinding conflicts fought not to win territory or secure the future, but to slow the bleeding just a little longer. Victories no longer inspire celebration. They inspire exhaustion. Another front stabilized means another one collapsing elsewhere. Another sacrifice buys time, not hope. And time is running out. The opening of the Great Rift tears the final illusion apart. The galaxy is split, not just physically, but spiritually. Entire regions are plunged into eternal darkness, cut off from the Emperor's light, from aid, from certainty itself. Worlds on the far side are left to rot in isolation, forced to confront horrors without guidance or reinforcement. For many, this is when faith finally breaks, not because gods are disproven, but because they are absent. The Imperium does not collapse in response. It hardens. Orders become absolute. Mercy vanishes entirely. Survival doctrine shifts from preservation to control. Humanity is no longer treated as something to be saved, but something to be managed until the end. The value of a human life drops lower than ever before, not because leaders are cruel, but because they are out of time. And beneath all of it, the warp waits. It feeds on despair, fear, and resignation, and never has humanity produced more of all three. Every silent prayer, every unspoken terror, every moment of hopeless endurance adds to the pressure. The universe does not punish humanity for its sins. It reflects them back, magnified. This is when the final realization takes hold. There will be no renaissance. No return to a golden age. No decisive victory that turns the tide. The Imperium is not a shield anymore. It is a life support machine, barely functioning, keeping a dying civilization conscious just long enough to witness its own decay. Humanity is not marching toward extinction in a single dramatic event. It is being stretched thin across an endless present of suffering. And that is the true cruelty of this era. If the end were near, there would be relief in it. If annihilation were swift, there would be mercy. But this time is defined by continuation. By survival without progress. By existence stripped of meaning and sustained purely out of fear of what lies beyond. For the average human, the experience is small, quiet, and unbearable. You wake up, you work, you obey, you pray, not because you believe things will improve, but because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. You are not fighting for a future you will see. You are maintaining a system that demands your suffering as proof of loyalty. And you know, deep down, that even this may not be enough. This is why ignorance remains the Imperium's final mercy. Most humans will never know the full truth. They will never understand the scale of the collapse, the permanence of the damage, or the impossibility of victory. They will die believing their sacrifice mattered, that their pain served a purpose, that somewhere, somehow, humanity was still winning. And perhaps that belief is the last kindness left. Because to know the truth, to truly understand this era, is to carry a weight no individual was meant to bear. The knowledge that there is no escape, no safe ending, and no guarantee that death will bring peace. Only the certainty that the universe is indifferent, and survival itself has become a form of punishment. This is the most horrifying time to be alive in Warhammer 40,000. Not because of monsters, not because of war, but because humanity endures in a universe that has already moved on from the idea of mercy. And as the galaxy continues to burn, grind, and decay, one final question lingers, quiet, unanswered, and eternal. If you were born into this age, would you want to know the truth at all?